The most pervasive misunderstanding about treating depression is the idea that it's primarily an effort problem, that the person could feel better if they tried hard enough, thought more positively, or simply chose to engage with their life more fully. This framing is not only unhelpful, it's actively harmful because it attributes the symptoms of a neurological condition to a personal failing, which adds shame to an already difficult experience and delays people from seeking the kind of help that actually addresses the underlying condition. Depression impairs the very systems that willpower draws on. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, motivation initiation, and the ability to override immediate impulses with longer-term goals, is one of the regions most affected by depression. Asking someone with depression to just try harder is a bit like asking someone with a broken leg to simply walk through the pain, not because the desire to walk isn't there, but because the mechanism for doing so is currently compromised. What works instead is approaches that work with the neurological reality of depression rather than against it. Behavioural activation, one of the most evidence-supported psychological approaches, doesn't ask for motivation before action. It asks for action before motivation, recognizing that in depression, motivation doesn't return on its own, but tends to follow small, achievable actions rather than preceding them. The goal is not to feel ready to act. The goal is to act in a way small enough that it doesn't require readiness, and then to notice that something, however small, has shifted. Self-compassion, similarly, is not a soft or vague idea. It's a specific neurological intervention. Treating yourself with the same warmth you'd offer a good friend who was struggling, rather than the harsh self-criticism that depression tends to generate, activates the brain's soothing system rather than its threat system, creating the neurological conditions in which change becomes possible. Harsh self-criticism contracts those conditions. Kindness opens them. Behavioural activation is one of the oldest, most robustly studied, and most practically useful approaches to depression available, and it's fundamentally simple in its logic, even if it's difficult in its application. The theory is this: depression produces withdrawal. Withdrawal reduces exposure to activities that generate reward, meaning, and connection. The resulting absence of reward and connection deepens the depression, which produces more withdrawal. This loop can sustain itself indefinitely without outside interruption, and behavioural activation is the interruption. The practice involves deliberately scheduling small, manageable activities, not challenging ones, not aspirational ones, but genuinely achievable ones, and then doing them, regardless of whether motivation is present first. The selection of activities matters. Behavioural activation works best when the activities chosen fall into one of two categories: activities that provide a sense of accomplishment, even if the accomplishment is very small, and activities that provide even minimal pleasure or connection. The combination of these two types tends to address both the anhedonia and the low self-efficacy that depression generates. A critical feature of behavioural activation is that the activities must be calibrated to the actual current state of the person, not to what they could manage when well, not to what they think they should be able to manage, but to what they can genuinely accomplish today. This is why the same external action, going for a walk, calling a friend, might be the right goal for one person and too ambitious for another, or even for the same person on a different day. A walk around the block is genuinely different from a 10-minute walk on a bad day. The mechanism by which behavioural activation works is also worth understanding. Action changes the neurological state, not dramatically and not immediately, but incrementally. Each small action produces a small release of dopamine through the effort-reward system, even when the reward is modest. Each completed action, however small, creates a small sense of self-efficacy, a minimal but real experience of having done something in a state where doing things is hard. These accumulate, not quickly but consistently. Rumination is one of the most consistent and distressing features of depression, and one of the most resistant to standard advice. Just stop thinking about it doesn't work. Not because the person isn't trying, but because the brain, in a depressive state, has structural reasons for returning to the same thoughts repeatedly, and telling it to stop doesn't address those structural reasons. The neuroscience of rumination involves the default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when we're not focused on an external task. In depression, the default mode network becomes hyperactive and hyperconnected with the amygdala, the threat detection center, which means the brain's resting state becomes a loop of threat-oriented, self-referential processing. This is not a choice, it's a feature of the depressive brain state. What interrupts rumination, rather than engaging with it, is anything that engages the task-positive network, the brain regions involved in focused, goal-directed activity. These networks are mutually suppressive. When one is active, the other is dampened. This is why specific, absorbing tasks, puzzles, cooking, physical activity, creative work, can interrupt rumination, while vague, low-demand activities, watching television without full attention, lying in bed thinking about stopping the thinking, often don't. Physical movement is particularly effective at interrupting rumination. Exercise activates multiple brain regions involved in the task-positive network, releases noradrenaline, which has an immediate mild antidepressant effect, and creates a body experience, sensations, breath, physical effort that anchors attention in the present rather than in the content of the thoughts. This is not the same as curing depression with a run. It's using a specific neurological mechanism to interrupt a specific neurological process. Mindfulness-based approaches offer another route. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, the most evidence-supported mindfulness approach for depression, works not by stopping thoughts but by changing the relationship with them, from being swept along in the current of the thought to observing the thought as a mental event with some degree of distance. This shift from identification to observation is subtle but powerful, and it's a skill that develops with practice rather than arriving complete. Recovery from depression is not only a psychological process. The body is implicated throughout, and addressing the body's contribution to depression is one of the most underutilized aspects of treatment. Sleep is perhaps the most foundational. The relationship between depression and sleep is bidirectional. Depression disrupts sleep architecture, and poor sleep deepens and prolongs depression. Addressing sleep is therefore not simply a quality of life improvement, it's a direct intervention in the depressive cycle. The evidence base for sleep hygiene in depression is robust. Consistent sleep and wake times, even on weekends, and even if you don't fall asleep easily, reduced light exposure in the evening, removal of screens from the bedroom, and avoiding lying in bed awake for long periods, getting up and doing something quiet until drowsy, all of these have evidence-supported effects on both sleep quality and depressive symptoms. For people who wake at 3 or 4 a.m. with disproportionate anxiety, a common pattern in depression related to the cortisol awakening response being advanced and elevated, this specific pattern has a name and a biological cause. Knowing this is useful because it means the dread of the early morning waking is not evidence that something terrible is true or that the depression is worse. It's a biological feature of the condition, and it can be addressed with treatment. Exercise is one of the most robustly evidenced interventions for depression outside of psychotherapy and medication. The evidence supports aerobic exercise, running, cycling, swimming, brisk walking at moderate intensity for around 30 minutes, 3 to 5 times per week. The mechanism involves neurogenesis, new neuron growth, in the hippocampus, which is suppressed by chronic cortisol exposure in depression and stimulated by aerobic exercise. It also involves noradrenaline release, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein important for neuroplasticity, and modest effects on serotonin and dopamine systems. The effect size for moderate-intensity aerobic exercise on mild to moderate depression is comparable to antidepressants, not as a replacement for severe depression or when a person is too depleted to exercise, but as a genuine first-line intervention that most people with mild to moderate depression are not told about. The barrier is that depression itself undermines motivation to exercise. Behavioural activation principles apply here. The goal is not to want to exercise before you do it. The goal is to design a version of it small enough to be genuinely possible in your current state. A 10-minute walk counts, and building from there. Depression is profoundly isolating, and isolation is also one of the primary mechanisms by which depression sustains itself. The combination creates one of depression's cruelest paradoxes. The condition makes connection harder at exactly the moment when connection is most needed. The neurological basis for this is reasonably well understood. Depression reduces oxytocin activity, oxytocin being the neurochemical underlying trust, social bonding, and the experience of social reward. This means social contact feels less rewarding and more effortful in depression, not because the person doesn't care about others, but because the neurochemistry that makes social contact feel good has been dampened. Simultaneously, the shame that accompanies depression, the sense of being a burden, of having nothing to offer, of one's company being worse than one's absence, drives active avoidance of exactly the connections that might help. Breaking this loop doesn't require large gestures. Research on social connection and depression consistently shows that minimal, low-barrier social contact produces benefit. A brief text exchange, a short phone call, sitting in a coffee shop around other people without needing to interact. The goal is to interrupt the isolation, not to immediately access the depth of connection that depression has made temporarily unavailable. Meaning is a related but distinct dimension. Viktor Frankl's observation that people can survive almost anything if they have a sense of meaning in it is relevant to depression recovery. The return of meaning, purpose, direction, something worth getting up for, is both a marker of recovery and a driver of it. For many people, meaning during depression is not found through grand reorientations, but through very small anchors, a plant they're tending, a person they feel responsible for, a task that connects them to a larger sense of purpose, however modestly. These small anchors matter. The relationship with other people who genuinely understand depression, either through personal experience or through professional support, is also specifically valuable. Being in the company of someone who doesn't need you to explain why ordinary things are hard, who doesn't respond with, "But you have so much to be grateful for," who simply recognizes and witnesses the experience without requiring it to be different. This kind of presence has a specific healing quality that is hard to quantify, but consistently significant. One of the most important things to understand about depression recovery is that it's non-linear, and that expecting linearity is one of the things most reliably derails it. Recovery from depression doesn't proceed steadily from unwell to well. It moves in phases that include improvement, plateau, and temporary regression. And each regression if it's not anticipated, can feel like a return to the beginning rather than a normal feature of recovery. Understanding that bad days occur throughout recovery and do not invalidate the good days that preceded them is one of the most important cognitive reframes available during the recovery process. The first signs of recovery tend to be small and easy to dismiss. Things that required effort begin to require slightly less effort. The morning weight, while still present, lifts a little earlier. There are moments, brief, fragile ones, of something that resembles genuine okayness. A flavor that tastes of something again. A conversation that feels, for a moment, real. These are not dramatic, but they are the beginning of the return of the brain's capacity to access positive experience, and they matter. Over weeks and months, these moments become more frequent, longer lasting, and less precarious. The flatness gives way, in patches, to warmth. Preferences re-emerge. The future, which in depression felt foreclosed, opens again. For many people, there is a point, usually somewhere in the middle of recovery rather than at its end, where they notice that they're better. Not completely well, not the same as before, but genuinely, measurably better. And the realization can bring both relief and grief. Relief that the improvement is real, and grief, sometimes, for the time the depression took. What holds throughout the recovery process is the need for continuity of care and continuity of the practices that support recovery. The temptation, when feeling better, is to stop the therapy, discontinue the medication, or let the sleep and movement practices slip, and the evidence suggests that maintaining these supports through and beyond symptom remission substantially reduces the risk of relapse. Getting well is one goal. Staying well is the one that matters more. And underneath all of this is a truth worth returning to, whenever the depression makes it hard to believe. Depression lies about permanence. It says this is how things are and how they'll stay. It is wrong. The evidence, accumulated across decades of research and millions of people who have recovered, is clear. Depression is one of the most treatable conditions in mental health. People recover, often fully. The path is rarely straightforward, but it is real, and it is open, and you are allowed to walk it.